Hello, everyone, and namaste. We are here today with a very special guest here on Faith and Politics, where we discuss policies that put people first. I'm here with someone very special, Dr. and Reverend Cari Jackson of the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. She is an amazing ally for me as a legislator. She is involved with these issues that are such contentious issues of our times around reproductive health care for all people, but especially for those who need it, who are the most vulnerable. And we are really glad to have you here. May I call you Cari?
Yes, please do.
Call me Padma.
Yes.
I do want to acknowledge a hat tip to our common friend, the Reverend Dr. Sabrina Dent, who introduced us and connected us. And so, Cari, tell our listeners and our viewers a little bit about yourself.
Well, I am the Director of Spiritual Care and Activism at RCRC. And I am an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ. I have served as a congregational pastor, not only within United Church of Christ, but also within the United Methodist Church, within the Presbyterian Church USA. I've served as seminary pastor at Union Theological Seminary in New York. And I have worked in community service and in spiritual space my entire adult life, because my spirituality is what grounds me in all of the work that I do. And I really do not separate spirituality from justice. The two are the same. They are the yin yang. They are alternate sides of the same coin for me. So I'm really glad to be with you.
And I'm really glad to have someone who is so rooted in faith and spirituality. For me, being in politics, as we talked about in one of our earlier conversations, Cari, that I really didn't want to be in the political activism space or in politics. But here I am because I just wanted to help others.
Yes,
I always thought
yes.
Volunteering is the ultimate exercise in democracy. And so I just volunteered. But I also want to acknowledge that faith has been really important in providing me a sense of security and balance as the winds around my life shifted and churned and made things difficult. And always my faith in the divine has enabled me to be calmer and deal with any ongoing challenges with more equanimity and poise. And
Yes.
so I really feel that same camaraderie with you, that is why faith is so important. But policy is also important, and how policy affects us as women is so critical. I just want to share with you a legislative win where we just passed in our state house a bill or legislation that I have championed during my time in the legislature. The bill that I introduced earlier in my second term was actually one that my desk mate, a man, had introduced, and that is to eliminate sales tax on feminine hygiene products or for products for those who menstruate. I really want to hear from you, from a faith perspective. What could we be doing more to help women? Especially, I know the work of rcrc.org, but our listeners might not know it. So if you would care to elaborate, that would be great.
Well, first, congratulations on that win. It is so important that we continue to challenge some of these things that have been normalized for decades and centuries, that there is a second-class citizenship for females and for those who identify as females. And tampon tax, removing that is a step toward greater equality. And I talk about how it's been normalized. There are so many ways in our culture and in our policies that women are treated as second-class citizens. And it's so normalized that even many women don't recognize it themselves. And so just being able to bring these kinds of issues to a legislative chamber and being able to talk about it is so important. And I know I live in Arizona, and there is an organization here that started with a focus on bringing supplies of feminine hygiene products to homeless, unhoused students in school, because many of the girls every month, they didn't have the money to afford feminine hygiene products. So every month they would miss days and days of school. And so there is an organization here in Arizona, I apologize, I'm not remembering the name of it right now, that addresses that. And so there's this intersection with gender justice and economic justice. And so we need to look at all of those kinds of things. And so much of the work that RCRC does is looking at the intersection of justice issues. We need to look at reproduction. That's a focus of our organization, but we can't just look at that in isolation, because there are some very real economic policies and realities that impact people. There are very real policies regarding how inmates in prisons are treated that impact their reproductive realities, and so on and so on. And so, as you say, policy is so important to all of it. But here's one thing I've been asking everywhere I've been going for the last 2 to 3 years. I've been asking people, what kind of society do you want us to be? So much of it turns on that. And whatever our answer to that question may be, it impacts what we do legislatively, judicially. It impacts what we do within our faith spaces, other spaces, on and on. But I just keep asking people that question.
I appreciate that idea because it really speaks to what I do as a legislator. What kind of things keep you up at night? When I go knock on doors, either during the campaign or during the legislative time, because I also knock doors when I'm not in a campaign year. Like, obviously you knock doors to canvass during a campaign year, but you also can knock doors to find out whether the policy that you're working on is policy that your constituents care about. And
Yes.
so I go door to door and I talk to people about, what is it that keeps you up at night? What are you worried about? And making sure that those are the things that I work on. And, in my first term, I championed certain legislation, and I want to share that with you. But I learned from knocking doors that a lot of people were concerned about prescription drugs and the high
Oh,
cost of prescription drugs. And I
yes.
would not
Yes.
have known, because I personally don't take any, ongoing medication. I'll take a vitamin and then I'll forget. And then, but I've been very fortunate that the only medications that we had to purchase regularly were my daughter's for her asthma and for other issues that she had. And so I think it's really important, though, that we engage people and ask them what kind of society they want and what kind of
Yeah.
things they want to implement. And as a legislator, that's also important to me. But one thing that I do think, whether you're a person of faith or a person in the political arena, we want to protect those who are vulnerable. Mahatma Gandhi once said that a democracy is strong when the voices of the most vulnerable or the weak are
Yes.
heard. I'm
Yes.
paraphrasing it. But I recognize that, being Hindu, being of Indian origin, I was born in India and I immigrated here, but I've heard a lot about Gandhi throughout my life, both from
Mhm.
the civil rights movement here and how Gandhi influenced people like the wonderful Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but many others as well, and how Gandhi is such an essential part of the Indian subcontinent's struggle for peace and
Yes,
achievement
yes.
of freedom from colonization. So going back to the idea that we must listen to the voices of the vulnerable, one of the things that I have championed is a bill to protect the vulnerable from online sexual predators. But I think that there's
Mm,
something about our faith. Mine comes more from an understanding of the human family as a divine family.
mhm.
But I know, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is the Hindu phrase. But please talk, I'd love to hear your perspective on how we protect the vulnerable, and especially, the work that you do, and the spiritual understanding, and how I can do a better job, and how we as a society can do a better job at protecting the vulnerable.
Well, as you cited the phrase from Gandhi, there is a parallel Christian scripture that talks about showing up with loving kindness and compassion for the least of these. And I love that. I even wrote a book titled For the Least of These. And that's separate from this conversation today.
No, tell us
But
about
it's
the book.
oh, well,
What is
I've
it?
written a
Yeah.
few books, but that particular one is really written to faith communities about how to show up with compassion for those within the faith community, because many faith communities will say they're seeking to help save the world, but they don't have compassion for people who are even part of their own community. And I believe if you don't have compassion for those within, you're less likely to have compassion for those who are outside the borders of your community. Because compassion is something that is not just an intellectual, but it is very much a heart thing. And it should be reflected in whatever we define as our morality. It should be. And it should be reflected in our legislative policies and our judicial decisions. But one of the things that's really important to me about the vulnerable, there's a lot of conversation as it relates to abortion, that those who are against women having the legal right to make decisions about their own bodies is that they want to protect the vulnerable, meaning the unborn. And what I ask is, what can we do first and foremost for the vulnerability of those who are independently living their lives right now? It is easy to say, I want to help those all the way over there, whether it's the unborn or the person in another country, and not show up with dignity and grace and justice for those who are moving around in their day here. And that's the thing that is really important. So as we were talking earlier about the tampon tax, and I was talking about young girls who miss school for days and days every month, I want to ask people, if you're concerned about the vulnerable, what are you going to do for these young girls? Because the impact for them is not only the finances and their health care, but it's also an impact on their lives going forward. Because we know anyone who misses school several days a month is highly likely to become less educated, and the long-term impacts on their lives. So when we talk about the most vulnerable, we really have to, I encourage people to use a standard that is important for me, and that is human dignity and human flourishing. So if I recognize someone as vulnerable, that means for me, there are contexts and conditions in their lives that greatly impede their human dignity. And I have a responsibility to help them be able to live their life within the and with the dignity that they define for themselves. I don't define that for someone, because that's part of what human dignity is, that each person has that kind of self-determination to be able to say, this is what would really affirm my life and support me in being able to flourish in my life. And so I applaud you for your work with the disability community and cerebral palsy in particular, because part of that is so very, very much about helping people to flourish, helping people to live with dignity within the context of their own lives. And that's wonderful work. So I applaud you for that.
Thank you. Somebody actually said in the award ceremony about how we should enable people to live their best life.
Yes, yes.
And one of the things that brings to mind is where we are today with addiction and mental health. You know, we're working on a lot of things to address and create infrastructure for those who have addiction, whether it's Alcoholics Anonymous, which is very much a faith-based organization, or many other support systems that we put in place once people have addiction, rehab programs. But what about doing things to prevent addiction? But how do we, look, I'll tell you my own personal faith journey. When we moved to India, I was 15, very vulnerable time for a teenager. Not only did we
Yes.
move from one place to another, we moved across the globe to the other side, to a society that I didn't really know how to fit in. I looked like everybody else, but I didn't sound or even think like everybody else. I didn't have a very similar experience and didn't have anyone that I could share those thoughts with, because my parents were my parents at an age when you're trying to separate and become an individual
Yes.
in your own right. And so it became very difficult for me. Plus, my parents were really easily able to acculturate. But faith played a huge role for me in that while I had no temples and no faith communities in the 70s growing up in the United States, when I got to India, well, guess what? That's the home of the Indian subcontinent, is where there are temples galore. Hinduism's
Yeah.
cradle is the Indian subcontinent. And there are temples across from Bangladesh to Pakistan, and of course, India in the middle. There are so many temples. Some I could connect with, some I had to, did not understand what were the practices. It's like if you're Catholic and you
Yes.
go into a Presbyterian or a Protestant church, you may not know. So there's
Yes.
a lot of differences in what I call the Indian denominations or the Sampradaya and practices. But I really felt loved by God. And there's a depiction of God near my college called Mahankali. And it was the fierce mother goddess, and she was going to protect you no matter what. And it was a beautiful, very, people will exoticize how she's depicted and what she does. But the basis of me at that age in college, where I could have become addicted to alcohol or some other, bad substance that would harm me, I knew that God loved me and God would protect me. In fact, my Catholic roommate took me to a small temple within walking distance, a little bit of a long walk, known for the Hanuman temple. And Shanta and I would walk to her church, and then we would, on the way back, we would stop at my temple, or vice versa, the Hanuman temple. And Hanuman is known both as a god and also as a devotee. And there's a lot of myth and storytelling about Hanuman, and people call him the monkey god. But the idea that Hanuman was there to protect.
Yes.
Hanuman is a protector as well. And so God protects and loves me, and how that really helped me during those critical years for not having an unhealthy relationship with alcohol, but also knowing that I was loved, and, that was such an anchor. And so let's just talk about like that, because I think that that's one of the things that I find challenging is God is a loving God. God is a protecting God. And from a Hindu tradition. And I would love to have from the United Church of Christ, from your own spirituality, for you to talk about from the scriptural tradition, or,
Wow.
share.
So when I think about addiction, there's three aspects of it as reflected in our culture. There's the criminalization, rehabilitation, and prevention. And so prevention, as you talk about that, one aspect of that, I believe, is what are the economic realities and the opportunities that people have in their lives. If people feel they don't have much opportunity, they are more likely to be influenced by those things that would satisfy the ache in their lives. So if they don't have a faith that helps anchor them, then the context that they live in, they are more likely, especially if they are poor, especially if they see they have limited opportunities in their lives, they're more likely to yield to the influences that will say, calm and satisfy and soothe that ache with this. And I say ache because I believe within each of us is this burning desire to live our best lives. You were talking about that earlier. It's in there. There's something in every one of us, no matter the circumstances of our lives, calling us and producing this yearning to live our best. When we live in a context where we're told, no, you can't have it because of your race, your gender, your economic class, your limited education, your disability, you name it. When there are doors after doors after doors that people feel are closed to them, they become much more likely to yield to the self-soothing influences that might be offered in their context. So whether those are influences are, or those self-soothing measures are alcohol or drugs of various sort, people are much more likely to yield to those. And some drugs, we have to be honest about it, some drugs are designed for people to become addicted to them so they can keep the economic, capitalist supply chain going in particular ways. And we know just this last year and this year, the incredible lawsuits there have been as it relates to Oxycontin that was designed for people to get addicted without any warnings for folks, et cetera, et cetera. And primarily who has become addicted to Oxy have been poor people across the US. And so that's why I'm always looking at these intersections. So when we talk about prevention, that entails looking at what are the accountabilities in our big pharmaceutical companies that we pay tax dollars to help support the development of pharmaceuticals. And we all know here in this country, we pay more money for the medications that people need than any other country in the world. And in an earlier iteration of my life, Padma, I worked for AARP, and I was very involved with volunteers who were working and staff who were working on behalf of legislative issues impacting seniors in this country. One of the big issues was pharmaceuticals, that many people couldn't afford to pay for their groceries and their medications. So it goes back to the question, what kind of society do we want to be? We were also looking at the reality in terms of self-soothing, that some people, older people who felt they had limited opportunities to express their best selves were much more likely to become prey to all kinds of scam artists, to prostitutes and internet and you name it, you name it, you name it. And so we looked at a range of those kinds of things, but all of it centering on that question of what kind of society do we want to be? And when I think about addiction, this is the last thing I'm going to say. Right now, we have in states across this country, women who are addicted to drugs, and they use drugs because there's not sufficient social support to help them find another path. They have children who have not been impacted by the drugs because I'm not a chemist, but I'll say this bit. The drugs, the size of the cells, they do not pass through the placenta. So the babies are born not addicted to those drugs, but the women get arrested. Is that the best for, and charged with child endangerment? But it's also the case, there are some women in this country right now who have epilepsy and other kinds of seizure-inducing situations where if they take their anti-seizure medication, it impacts their ability to carry a pregnancy to full term. So some women are not taking their anti-seizure medication and they're using marijuana. They might live in a state where it's not recognized as medical marijuana. If they live in a state that does not recognize medical marijuana, again, same situation. They give birth to their child in the hospital, they drug test as having marijuana in their system. The newborn does not, but they're being arrested. And so that's not even a situation of addiction, but because we approach addiction in the way that we do in this country, it does not help most people. More people are likely to go to prison or go in and out of rehab centers or be arrested for child endangerment when that's not what was happening. And so we really need some very different policy as it relates to how we understand pharmaceuticals in this country and how we legislate the management of those. But it also requires a very different kind of healthcare system from what we have. So that's why I'm glad you're there doing what you do.
So one of the things that I recently discovered that I've been trying to get exact numbers, especially for Michigan, is the fact that many of the people who are working 40 hours a week or more are also availing themselves of federal benefits, such as Medicaid.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And that means that, to me, this is the country and this is the state where the pathway to the middle class was created by the unions, by the benefits that union positions gave: a 40-hour work week, retirement benefits, healthcare benefits, paid sick leave, those things that create a economically sustainable worker base.
Yes.
Now we're talking about worker shortages. Well, guess what? The issue is also that we have to have conditions for workers that they are not collecting federal benefits because they're getting paid and provided the resources that would create a sustainable employment. And so I think this is something that we should, again, the faith aspect of it, I remember from Gospel of Mark, chapter 12, there's a question, when Jesus goes to the mount and they ask him questions. And there's a question about taxes. Do you remember that? Can you tell us a little bit about that piece?
And the answer, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's. From how many people have understood and interpreted scripture. And I often talk about how many people have their own social belief that they then put a theological frame on to justify it. And I cite this because while in the Jesus time, tax collectors were not seen as really good people. Part of that was because they were being occupied by the Romans. So, you mentioned about colonialization earlier, and we've had colonialization run throughout history, where one group is colonizing and occupying another group. And so tax collectors were not viewed during Jesus' time as very positive, and taxes were not viewed as very positive because of the conditions of occupation in which the Jews were living. And the tax dollars were being taken not really for their benefit, but to fill the coffers of the occupiers of the Romans. And so much of that thinking, or at least how people have interpreted those scriptural references, has really come into this era unfortunately, in a lot of Christian churches. There are some churches, conservative churches, that teach against paying taxes. And there are some Christian churches who have adopted this very this very individualistic approach, which I believe is counter to Scripture. Because in Jesus and his disciples, they talked often about bringing things in common so that everyone's needs could be met. And also, one of my favorite scriptures from Deuteronomy, in what Christians call the Old Testament, and it's part of the Tanakh for Jews, talks a lot about welcoming the immigrant, being hospitable to immigrants. People don't talk about those kinds of things now. But also, one of my favorite is every 70 years was called the Year of Jubilee, in which everyone's debts were erased. We don't have that as part of American capitalism at all. I mean, what would it be like if we wiped out debts from people? For me, I have a law degree, and then I got a Master of Divinity degree, and then I got a PhD. And then, of course, the undergraduate degree to begin all of that. There were student loans from me throughout that time. What would my life look like today if I had never had those student loans? Some people have the benefit of being born in family systems where they don't have student loans. Other people don't have that benefit. It's policy and people of faith. And this is why I think people of faith have a particular responsibility to look at our scriptural texts anew, because in every major religion, there are things that are guiding principles. Compassion is one of them. Another is not judging other people, but focusing on the ways you need to learn and grow and heal in your own life. Another is mutual accountability. Those are things that run across sacred texts, across religious traditions. Yet, we don't bring those into this vision of society. And we often do not bring those into our public policy. And those are the kinds of things I really long for, still with that goal of what can we do to help people in their human flourishing, to help people live their best life. And I believe that as each of us lives our best life, our society becomes its best self.
Thank you so much. That is so great. It resonates for me. Hopefully it has resonated with those who listen today to Faith and Politics. I just want to leave everyone with these words from the Mark chapter that I was talking about, Gospel of Mark chapter that I was talking about. the passage is verses 13 to 17. And in it, the Pharisees and the Herodians go to Jesus basically to trap him. And they say, we know that you're a man of integrity and whatever. And they ask whether it's right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not. And Caesar, the last verse in this segment says, Jesus says, give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's.
Yeah.
So with that, I'd like to say thank you for sharing this little segment of your life with us and with those who listen to Faith in Politics. We really need to create policy that puts people first. Thank you so much, Dr. Reverend Cari Jackson, for joining me.
Thank you. Namaste. And again, thank you for all that you do.